The 1960s giveth, and the 1960s taketh away. Let's talk about what was possibly the most bipolar decade in our history. The story of my life. Hey everyone, I'm Felix, and this is the story of my life. Today we're talking about the 1960s, and yeah, I was born in 1960, so maybe some of the early stuff I don't remember real well. But I definitely do remember having been told about it, and reading about it. And from like 65 on, I do have memories of it. 1960 started with hope. It started with the new frontier of JFK.
But the new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer to the American people, but what I intend to ask of them.
And how he was going to, he made the promise. We will land on the moon by the end of the decade. And we actually did. Unfortunately, he wasn't there to see it. Because in 1963, he was assassinated.
Reminder from his mother, and John celebrates his 3rd birthday with a soldier's farewell to his father.
Now, little story there. I was only 3 years old when he was assassinated. And I have no idea if maybe this is my first memory, or if I just have it in my head because my parents talked about it. But I was in my high chair, and apparently I got a hold of my father's newspaper. Yes, we read newspapers in those days. And on the front cover was a big picture of JFK. And I, at my 3-year-old self, sat there and went like this. He died. I have no idea how I knew about it. I don't even think my parents had had a chance to really talk about it in front of me very much. But apparently they were quite shocked that I did know. And it was something that they talked about up until their deaths. But yeah, in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And it kind of sucked all that hope and new frontier talk out of the whole country. We were starting to get into Vietnam. Weren't really there yet, but it wasn't even a daily news story yet. But we were getting into Vietnam. And Lyndon Johnson was very clear about that. Then, as I spoke about in my first video on this channel, talking about growing up in Brooklyn, my world was fine. Everything was great and happy and peachy, as I talked about my best friend at that time, whose nickname was Peachy. But there was all of this turmoil bubbling under the surface. And you almost had the feeling that it had to bubble up. But then 1964 hit, and the British invasion, as I talked about in my last video. And it was almost a ray of hope again. This great music being put out. And just everything was okay. 1965, on November 9th, 1965, my 5th birthday, The entire East Coast was plunged into a blackout. And I do remember specifically my mother pulling my birthday cake out of the oven, she made it, and saying that the city put the lights out so that I could see my candles better. It was almost a magical time for me. I don't have a whole lot of memories about 66 or 67. I know that the music was exploding. I know that the Vietnam War was escalating. And now it was a daily subject of the news. Wasn't until a little later on that Walter Cronkite would start giving the numbers on how many Americans had died that day or the previous day in Vietnam. It was a time of, I guess you could call it, subdued chaos. And then in 1968, that subdued chaos became true, unblushing chaos. When in April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed.
Martin Luther King 20 minutes ago died. I would like to take this opportunity to ask Reverend John Genzel, who is the jazz minister, to lead all of us in prayer.
All of the civil rights stuff that was happening in the country was great. It was again a ray of hope. And a lot of that was being spearheaded by Martin Luther King Jr. His Million Man March. His I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And all of that just seemed to be brought crashing down when he was assassinated in Memphis. And I think that was the action that brought all of that turmoil that was bubbling underneath truly to the surface. And then what we called them at the time were the race riots. Happened. The Black Power marches. And they weren't always very peaceful. There was burning of buildings, there was looting, there was marches that would see nothing get in their way. And I actually experienced one of them right outside my window coming down Crescent Avenue in Brooklyn. And I was scared. I don't know. I think I was only scared because of the amount of people that seemed so angry. But a lot of America was scared because it felt like that their society was getting ready to blow up. And then in June, another somewhat leader of the civil rights movement, a person who was very much in the almost image of his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was assassinated. And that was like taking a fire that was burning pretty well and throwing a ton of gasoline on it. And the country was going into an uproar. The Vietnam War had gotten to a point of no return. We were in the war, we were fighting the war, and we were losing Americans every day. The peace movement really started to make a rise. The hippie counterculture Again, hippie is not a phrase that we would use today, but it's what we used then. The hippie counterculture came to the forefront. All We Need Is Love by the Beatles came out. And it was just, in a way, bipolar. Because you had all of this tragedy happening. And it was almost being offset by the movement of peace. The desire for peace. So 1968 specifically was probably the most bipolar year of a bipolar decade. And then in 1969, it was almost like we started to see a few rays of sunshine coming through the clouds. My parents had moved from Brooklyn to Long Island. And there's another little side story. They moved pretty much in the middle of one of the biggest blizzards in the history of New York and Long Island. And it hit Long Island a little bit more, so naturally we were moving from Brooklyn to Long Island into the little bit more. Mayor Lindsay was the mayor of New York City at the time, John Lindsay, and he was, by all accounts, elected because he was good looking. He was good looking and charismatic, and the mishandling of this snowstorm almost ended his political career. It was so bad that people in certain neighborhoods in New York City were having to dig their own streets out because the plows just weren't going there. He was so focused on Manhattan that the other four boroughs pretty much were forgotten. So on February 16th, my parents moved from Brooklyn, New York to Lindenhurst, Long Island. And that was about 4 days after the blizzard. So we were moving in snowdrifts. I was only 8 years old, so I didn't have to do a whole lot of the lifting and a whole lot of the moving. That was my brother and my father and his brother. But the reason they moved was only partially because of all of the turmoil that was going on in New York City. The landlady at the time, Gracie was her name, and her husband had decided to give our apartment to their son. So they basically told us we had to leave. But not in totally small part, the tension, the atmosphere of the Brooklyn neighborhood we lived in, Cypress Hills, had really gotten bad. It was at that time that Franklin K. Lane High School was named one of the most dangerous high schools in America. And that was the high school both of my older siblings were going to. And my next younger sibling was going to be going to. There were the race riots. And crime was way on the rise. It would only be a few years after that that Saturday Night Live debuted, and when they used to open, they used to say live from the most dangerous city in America, New York. So, my parents felt that. My parents obviously were also being pushed to leave, and they just didn't want to stay in New York anymore. So they decided to move to Long Island, to a suburb. I will never understand how people then, actually found out about these things because we didn't have any internet. I have no idea how my parents even discovered Lindenhurst. But they did. And in 1969, we moved there. By the way, if you're into these stories, talking about these days and the story of my life, don't you forget to hit that subscribe button and give the video a like. It helps out. But in 1969, we moved. And Woodstock happened. And it was 3 days of peace and love. There was 0 incidents recorded of any violence. And there were 250,000 people there. 250,000 people and not one single incident of violence over 3 days. And the weather was terrible. There was a lot of rain, there was mud, but that didn't drive anybody to have any violent tendencies. It was a weekend of pure love and peace. And again, you almost felt like the sun was starting to shine through these clouds. The Vietnam War was in full swing. Walter Cronkite was reporting daily how many Americans had been killed in the war that day. But also, we landed on the moon. And I'm not sure, but I think to this day, it is the single most watched piece of television ever aired. And it had everybody looking to the skies. And then we rolled over to the 70s. And that's what I'm going to be talking about going forward. My life in the 70s. Until next time, I'm Felix. And this is the story of my life.